And good evening, everyone. I'm Russ Mitchell. Campaign 2006, the Virginia Senate debate starts now. Both candidates are being highly scrutinized by thousands of voters all across Virginia tonight. Almost every voter in Virginia has access to tonight's forum. The debate is being broadcast on some 19 television stations in the state and even nationally. It's also being heard on even more radio stations. This is your chance to hear directly from the candidates on their views for Virginia, for the nation, and for the world. Tonight is the opportunity for you to make up your own mind, so let's get right to it. Hoping to keep his seat in the Senate, former delegate, congressman, governor, and for the past 60 years nearly, the Old Dominion's junior senator. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. George Allen.
Thank you.
His opponent's resume looks much different. Highly decorated Marine during Vietnam, former policy advisor and Secretary of the Navy. He's been a journalist, a best-selling novelist, and now he's a candidate for Senate. Please welcome Mr. Jim Webb. And now let's get to the particulars of tonight's debate. First, both candidates have prepared opening statements 2 minutes long. Alternating as they go, I'll ask each 2 questions on the top issues that face you, the voters. The first candidate will have 1 minute and 15 seconds to respond, and then the other candidate will have 45 seconds for rebuttal. And then a panel of representatives from our hosts, the League of Women Voters, CBS 6, WTVR, and WCVE Public Television, will press the candidates for more details on a variety of topics. Here's where it gets interesting. The candidates will then ask each other questions about topics they feel are important to this race. Then there is another 2 minutes for each to sum up his thoughts in their closing statements. We have 2 representatives from the League of Women Voters in attendance to keep time for each section. If you hear this bell, very good. That means the candidate has gone over his allotted time and must stop immediately. There is a live studio audience here with us tonight, but they're going to remain silent throughout the hour. We ask they check their emotions and hold any further applause until the end of the broadcast. We decided tonight's order to go by the flip of a coin. And Mr. Allen, you'll begin. You have 2 minutes for your opening remarks. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm pleased to be here with my wife, Susan, my partner for over 20 years, and also with all of you all to discuss issues that matter to our future. For more than a decade, I've had the honor of serving you as governor and now in the United States Senate, and together we have made a positive impact on so many people's lives. We made Virginia safer by abolishing parole for violent criminals. We reformed welfare. We invested in schools and had high academic standards. We cut taxes and created new good-paying jobs. In the United States Senate, I work with my partner, John Warner, to protect our freedom and to make sure America is a land of opportunity for all. I've offered specific plans to reduce our dependence on Middle East oil, to secure our borders, to invest in education, and strengthen our economy. That's why this election is so important. By cutting wasteful spending and keeping taxes low, we can keep America's economy growing, create new jobs, and help families with their financial security. But my opponent has an opposite view. He doesn't stand with John Warner and me in keeping taxes low. He stands with Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and the big government National Democrats who want to raise taxes. They want to reverse the very tax relief that helped our economy come back strong after the shock of 9/11. The tax relief that is now producing record levels of jobs for Americans, home ownership, investment, and opportunities for American families. My opponent wants to reimpose the marriage penalty, reimpose the death tax, and slash the child tax credit by half. His plan for higher taxes will take more than $2,000 every year from the average Virginia family. That will hurt our economy, and that will hurt your family. My friends, I know there's a better way. I trust free people and free enterprise, and that's a key difference in this campaign.
Mr. Webb, you have 2 minutes.
Well, I'd like to say how much I'm grateful to be here tonight as a candidate to the United States Senate. What Senator Allen just said about taxes isn't true. We can get into that later. It's only one person up here who's ever raised taxes, and that's George Allen. I would like to say that we need to think about what he just said. These are different times in America for different people. How you're doing depends in many cases on where you're sitting. 2/3 of the people in this country worry that it's headed in the wrong direction, and yet we re-elect 91% of our incumbent politicians. The stock market is at an all-time high. Corporate profits are at the highest percentage of our national wealth in history. And yet nearly 10% of the companies on the Fortune 500 list don't pay any taxes at all. And worse, if you look at wages and salaries for our workers as a percentage of our national wealth, they're at an all-time low, having gone down in real terms for 4 years in a row. The leaders of this administration and their followers claim that we are in a life and death struggle against international terrorism and that the war in Iraq is the central front of this war on terrorism. And yet, very few of these leaders are willing to invest their own loved ones in this effort. We have the best hospitals in the most advanced medical care in the world, and yet 47 million Americans, and that's 15% of this population, are without health insurance. And for the rest of us, medical care costs have gone up 73% in the last 6 years, 36% out of our own pockets, threatening to bust family budgets. America needs leaders who understand these divisions and want to repair them. Leaders whose views on foreign policy are formed by experience rather than sound bites. Leaders who measure the health of our society by what's good, not at the top 1%, but with our working men and women. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for the questioning. And remember, you have 1 minute and 15 to respond and 45 seconds for rebuttal. Mr. Allen, I'll begin with you. As we speak tonight, more than 2,700 Americans have been killed in Iraq, 80 of those from Virginia. Over the weekend, 776 Americans were wounded in Iraq. You have long supported President Bush's policy of staying the course, but just on Friday, your partner, as you call him, here in Virginia, Senator John Warner, said we need to reassess Iraq. Do you still believe that we should stay the course? And in your mind, are we winning the war in Iraq?
I have concerns about the war in Iraq like all Americans do. It is a very important battlefield in front of the war against these maniacal, hate-filled terrorist organizations who, if given a crack, will hit our country again. I want our troops to come home as soon as possible. I want them to come home in victory, not defeat. It's been tough on families, and I see one family member here, Rhonda Winfield from the Shenandoah Valley, who lost her son and gave me his dog tags that I keep on my dresser and see every morning. And she understands, as do others, that we must persevere. We cannot be a country that just loses faith in our ability to protect ourselves. What my colleague John Warner and I discussed about it is, yes, it's tough there. And our goal is to make sure that Iraq is a country that is on our side in the war on terror. It cannot remain a country in disagreement. It cannot become a safe haven for terrorists, because that would make our country less secure, and that is a risk that we cannot afford. And that's a bottom line agreement that John Warner, Secretary Baker, and I have, is rather than retreating, we need to make sure that Iraq is not a safe haven for terrorist organizations, because it's too risky for our security.
Mr. Webb, you have 45 seconds.
I think what you're seeing in the Republican Party is a shift away from the theorists who brought us the strategic blunder toward the realists, people like Jim Baker and in some cases Senator Warner, who are realizing that not that this is a war that could be run by these propagandistic phrases that have dominated this campaign, like cut and run or stay the course, but by smart strategy that will bring a solution. What Secretary Baker was saying over the weekend was that we need to get a diplomatic solution. We need to move toward discussing issues with Syria, which he did last week, and Iran. We need to have a formula that will end this war in a smart way that will bring stability to the region.
Mr. Allen, a quick follow-up for you. How would you define victory in Iraq?
We have to constantly adapt in Iraq, operationally by tactics, but our strategy is the same, and that is, I would consider victory in Iraq that the Iraqi people themselves, with their own backbones, their own minds, their own hearts, and their own hands, take control of their own destiny, and that Iraq, an oil-rich country, does not become a safe haven for terrorists. Look what al-Qaeda was able to do to us with having Afghanistan, a relatively poor country, as their base of operations. In the event that Iraq was a safe haven or sanctuary for terrorists, that would be much more dangerous for our country. And so the bottom line is Iraq cannot be a safe haven for terrorists. The Iraqis need to be controlling their own destiny, and that's the goal, and that's how I would define victory.
Mr. Webb, a question for you, and again, you have 1:15 to answer this. Republicans have said you have been very quick to say what we should not do in Iraq. You're a former Secretary of the Navy. What would you do about the situation in Iraq?
Well, the interesting thing that we are seeing right now, particularly with Secretary Baker and the Iraq study group, is exactly what I've been saying for the last 2 years. I've been saying for more than 2 years that we need to get an announcement from this government that we have no desire for long-term bases in Iraq, and that we need to reach overtly for a diplomatic solution. And we need to bring the countries in the region to the table. And my bet, I'm an optimist, my bet is when this Iraq study group reports out, which will be after the election, that is the direction that they are going to go to. Nobody wants to see terrorism in Iraq or elsewhere. We can address international terrorism from bases that are not in Iraq. In fact, when we took out al-Zarqawi, we took him out with troops that were stationed outside of Iraq. The difficulty in Iraq right now is we do have sectarian violence that's overwhelmed the country. We have more than 100 people, civilians, dying in sectarian violence every day. If you extrapolate that out to the United States, that would be more than 1,500 Americans dying in sectarian violence every day. We need to move toward a diplomatic solution, and we need creative leadership that will bring it in that direction.
Mr. Allen, you have 45 seconds.
Well, withdrawing or retreating or surrendering Iraq by leaving the country is not going to make Iraq safer, and it's clearly not going to make America safer. My friend, Mr. Webb, will talk about, gosh, we're occupiers. We're not occupiers, we're liberators in Iraq, and I don't look at our troops as occupiers. He talks about us wanting to be there permanently. I don't want American troops to be there a second longer than necessary. I want them to come home in victory, not defeat. Moreover, he'll talk about the permanent bases. The 4 bases that we have in Iraq reduced from 100 to 4. And in fact, I've voted at least 3 times this year alone to say that these are not permanent bases. It was included in the Defense Appropriations Bill, and it's signed into law. So those bases there, Jim, are not permanent bases. They're there for the security of our troops.
Mr. Webb, same follow-up question for you. How would you define victory in Iraq?
I think what you need to have in Iraq is a diplomatic solution where you can get the countries who have a historic cultural interest and political interest in Iraq to the table, so that they're going to work out this formula one way or the other. When George Allen says that he doesn't want to have, we want a troop out as fast as we can get them out, it's also on record as saying that they could be there 20, 30, or 50 years. So we can get our troops out of Iraq and get them out of this internecine violence, and at the same time bring the countries in that region to the table. We did it in Afghanistan, by the way, right after the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. We brought the countries in the region together and worked toward a solution that resulted in a Karzai government. Just beat your bell, I think.
Mr. Allen, race was not an issue in this campaign until you called a Virginian of Indian descent macaca. That video clip has been seen by millions of Americans, and now some people, including some folks in your own party and your former teammates from your football days, have said that you have used a racially charged word, the N-word. You say you're not a racist. Are these people lying? Why should the people of Virginia believe you?
People of Virginia can look at my record as a governor and look at my record as United States Senator. There's been a lot of talk about these different things, and I made a mistake, careless words. I've apologized for it, and it's been discussed right much. And then you have these baseless allegations who do not depict who I am, how I was raised, or what I believe in. And most importantly, I think the best way that all of you all can determine who I am is not by baseless allegations from 30 years ago, but look at my record as governor and also in the United States Senate. My very first speech on the Senate floor was for Roger Gregory to be on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, advocating fair treatment of Roger Gregory, and he is now the first African American on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. I was one of the original sponsors for extending the Voting Rights Act. I've been a strong advocate through the years for improving education opportunities and technology at minority-serving institutions, in particular for Virginia, historically black colleges and universities. And that is why, as senior African American legislator. Senator Benny Lambert has endorsed me, as well as Reverend Glenn, as well as Portsmouth Mayor, a Democrat, James Hawley, and many other African Americans, because they look at my record of performance and action, and that's the best way to determine someone's heart and future.
Mr. Webb, you have 45 seconds.
Well, I think this issue has been discussed ad nauseum. The objections that I had to that one event were that I thought that Senator Allen was unnecessarily bullying someone on my staff in front of people where the individual on my staff really felt singled out. In terms of the rest of this, I'm very grateful that I've had the endorsement of the Black Legislative Caucus here in Virginia, of the Latino groups, of Muslim groups, of the Asian American groups, and I look forward to working with them in the future.
Mr. Allen, just so we understand it, you call them baseless allegations. Are you saying that these people who said that you used the N-word, albeit 30 years ago, are lying?
What I said is I don't recall using that word, but the stories were portraying it as if that word were part of my vocabulary, which it was not, and that was what's inaccurate. And then there's all sorts of absolutely ludicrous stories as well. And I might add that also the former president of the NAACP, Paul Gillis, has endorsed me. The Latino Coalition has endorsed me. And people who know me and know my record have endorsed me because they recognize I believe this should be a land of opportunity for all people.
Mr. Webb, your opponent has recently begun airing advertisements from women enrolled at the Naval Academy when a controversial article you wrote entitled "Women Can't Fight" was published 27 years ago. In it, you wrote that you never met a woman whom you could trust to provide leadership in combat. Several women said that article promoted sexist attitudes and set back co-education at the Naval Academy. Why should the women of Virginia believe that you were, to borrow your phrase, born fighting for them?
Born Fighting actually is the title of a book based on the Scottish national slogan. And with respect to this, again, this is something that's 27 years old. Senator Allen's campaign were the ones who did the commercials and engendered a lot of this stuff. We got a lot of calls from women supporting us. I think people need to look at my record. When I was Secretary of the Navy, I opened up more operational billets to women than any Secretary of the Navy in history, and I did it on my own initiative. And if anyone wants to have a true truth teller here, all you have to do is look at my campaign staff. If you want to know how I appreciate and seek out qualified women, my campaign manager, my deputy campaign manager, my media director, my deputy media director, my director of finance, and my director of scheduling are all women. And I think, as there's a saying in the law, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself.
Mr. Allen, 45 seconds.
Well, on women, I'm proud of my record on women's issues, and a lot of this came up on Jim because of the statements he wrote, and in fact wrote even more recently in 1997, 1998, which repeated the allegations that women should be in military academies and how they had changed the culture of the military. And that was written in 1997 and 1998, I believe.
Didn't say that in that article, George.
Well, read the article again.
Well,
I'm proud of my record on women. When as governor, we had 4 very strong women leading everything from welfare reform to health and human resources to natural resources to education and other matters that were important in Virginia. And also, in the effort to make sure this is a land of opportunity for all, I've been a strong advocate of getting more women interested in science and engineering, because only 15% of the graduates from engineering school are women, and we need more women and more Latinos and more African Americans in those key fields of innovation.
Mr. Webb, just to be clear, what do you think about women in combat?
The question, I'm very comfortable with where the United States military is today. I've said it many times. That article was about women in specific combat military occupational specialties. That was the issue. And the 97 article did not address women at the Academy at all. And around 1997, George Allen was still opposing women being admitted to VMI. So.
False in 1997.
Okay, 96? We've had your speech, George.
In 1990, yes, and when the...
You'll get a... They're really on their job tonight. You're going to get a chance to ask each other questions later on. Right now, we're going to go to the next segment of the debate for Senate. Let's formally introduce our panel. First, Lulu Meese is president of the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Ms. Meese is one of the founders of the Virginia Women's Legislative Roundtable and a lobbyist for women's and children's issues at the Virginia Legislature for some 25 years. May Lily Lee is the host and senior producer of Virginia Currents, a public affairs and documentary program produced right here at WCVE and seen on public broadcasting stations throughout most of the state. She's no stranger to Virginia politics. She's covered 5 gubernatorial elections and was on the panel in the first debate in the race for governor right here in Virginia last year. And finally, Rick Young, an anchor and reporter with CBS 6 WTVR here in Richmond. Rick has worked in television in cities across the country, including Cleveland, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Indianapolis. Over the years, he's also won multiple awards for his reporting and was in Washington, D.C. to cover the attack on the Pentagon on September 11th. Each panelist will ask a question of a candidate. He'll then have 1 minute to answer, and then the other candidate will have 30 seconds for rebuttal. Lulu is going to begin with a question for Mr. Allen. Lulu?
Okay, Mr. Allen, as you know, the League of Women Voters is very interested in getting information to citizens so that they can become part of our government. In fact, we think of them as the fourth estate of government. I am very concerned at this time at the great amount of secrecy in our government at all levels, and I find it very difficult to get information many times. I would like to ask you how you would be able to help us solve that problem.
Well, one of the greatest inventions of all time since the Gutenberg press is the internet, and I think more information ought to be online. There's a great deal of concern about spending in Washington, and there's a measure that I was a sponsor of that Senator Coburn of Oklahoma introduced, and it would make it easier for people to be able to determine where spending is in various budgets and appropriations bills. And I think that if you have more sunlight and more sunshine on legislation, and there's Thomas, you can get that online, which as far as what's going on in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, but also I think there needs to be more scrutiny as to the spending of the taxpayers' money, and the more scrutiny, the better. And I also think that if there were more scrutiny earlier, we wouldn't end up with bridges to nowhere and indoor rainforests and Iowa and dog kennels and Rhode Island being funded. I'd like to see the president have the line item veto, as I had as governor, to knock out that wasteful spending. But the more scrutiny of spending, the better.
Mr. Webb, you have 30 seconds.
I think you raise a very important point. As someone who has spent 8 years in the military and or in the Pentagon, the number of security classifications has skyrocketed during this administration. The number of items that are considered to be classified where people can't examine them. And this is a question of the weakness of Congress in a one-party system in many cases, where if you don't have the proper oversight, then the executive branch takes off on its own. And I have shared that concern.
May Lily has the second question for Mr. Webb.
In November, Virginians are going to be voting not only on candidates, but also on issues. And one referendum would amend the Virginia Constitution to define marriage and ban civil unions. Do you support or oppose this amendment?
I oppose this amendment. I'm going to vote against it, as is Governor Kane, and I oppose this on legal rather than religious grounds. I'm a Christian. In my faith, I believe that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. But that is not what concerns me about this piece of legislation. I don't think anyone of any religion is going to have their religious sacraments taken away from them by the United States government. But we do have a situation, if you look at the second paragraph of this amendment, where clearly you can have a number of people, some of them gay and some of them heterosexual, that are going to have rights taken away from them unnecessarily. And I think we have a law right now that states, defines marriage. I feel very strongly that we don't need to amend the Constitution. If other people feel differently, go to the poll and vote, but that's the way I'm going to vote.
Mr. Allen, 30 seconds.
I believe the most important institution in all of our society is the family. It's more important than local government, state government, the Congress, the president, or a governor. It is in a family that young people learn right from wrong, where you learn manners, the work ethic, and important postulates for living. I feel very strongly that marriage should be between one man and one woman. It is the values and views of the people of Virginia, and this is a way to protect the values and views of the people of Virginia from judges who want to impose their own elitist views. And so I'm going to strongly be supporting this amendment and voting yes for marriage between one man and one woman.
Rick Young now has a question for Mr. Allen.
Mr. Allen, recently in Herndon, Virginia, there was a battle over building a shelter for day laborers, most of them illegal aliens, and it was built. Do you believe that tax dollars ought to be used to support those who entered this country illegally?
This country, Rick, is a country that is a land of immigrants. It's been built by immigrants, improved by immigrants. It is also a nation of laws. My mother is an immigrant. And I don't think we ought to be rewarding illegal behavior with amnesty. It is one of the reasons I voted against the Senate bill. My opponent supported that Senate bill and would reward illegal immigration with amnesty. So my view is what we need to do is protect our borders with a real fence, with sensors and a virtual fence, more detention centers, and more border patrol so we don't have to rely so much on the National Guard. But the bottom line is, this is a country that has been built by immigrants. It's legal immigrants, and we should not be rewarding illegal behavior because all that will do is encourage more illegal behavior. Decisions on spending are by local governments, but the postulates and the guidance and principles for me are let's secure our border, because a country that cannot secure its own border cannot protect its own people and uphold our laws.
Mr. Webb.
I love how George Allen comes up with my positions. I didn't support either the Senate or the House bill, and I've had my own views on immigration, but to specifically answer your question, this administration has failed to address immigration. We have had 4 million more illegals come since the beginning of this administration that were here before. We've gone from 8 million to 12 million. So they can talk about securing the borders and all the rest of it, but they haven't addressed the question. And when you have situations like these shelters, what you have is very near where I live, Colmore is 2 blocks from where I live. You have places like 7-Elevens that are just mobbed with people trying to find work. And that's one of the reasons I think that they have built these shelters, is to free up businesses and make a collection point until somebody else can solve this larger problem.
Let's go back to Lulu Meese, who has a question for Mr. Webb.
Mr. Webb, the federal deficit at this time is $8.5 trillion. And for 2006, it's $558 billion. The thing that really concerns me is that $298 billion for this year is borrowed from Social Security Trust Fund and Retirement Trust Fund. And the other $260 billion is borrowed from Asian banks. We have a great deal of our debt in the hands of Asian banks. Are we secure when we have to go to them again and again to fund our country?
No, we're not. And particularly with respect to having to borrow so much from China. China is our potentially #1 strategic adversary. I've been speaking about this for 19 years, warning people even before the situation with international terrorism in Iraq that China was developing a strategic axis with the Muslim world. Pakistan has a nuclear weapon because of China. Libya was supported by China. Iran has been a partner of China. We want to bring China into the world community, but we do this with great vulnerability when we have a balance of trade that we have with them, and we have allowed them to devalue their currency to the point that it's 40% below what it should be, and we're using this money to finance our national debt. We have to use pay-as-you-go budgeting. We need to calm the situation in the Middle East by getting out of Iraq. That will help our national debt, but we need to get into the balance of trade, and China is the key.
Mr. Allen?
I'll just to agree on something. I do agree with China being a threat. China cheats in trade, and they are building up their navy. Now, insofar as spending is concerned, I think there ought to be a taxpayer's Bill of Rights. First and foremost, it should be that we protect taxpayers from having tax increases. Secondly, I believe that in the federal government, they ought to have the same power and authority I had as governor. There ought to be the line item veto. There ought to be a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, as we have in Virginia, make priorities of national defense and education. And there ought to be required a 60-vote supermajority for any spending greater than the rate of inflation. That will protect the taxpayers.
May Lilly has a question for Mr. Allen.
This relates to our dependence on foreign fossil fuel. Here in Virginia, there's a company known as Virginia Biodiesel. They're out of New Kent County. In fact, President Bush toured it. And they are in the business of making crop-based diesel fuel. And they say they can't even keep up with demand. It's so incredible. Well, can't something be done to step up the production and the development of alternative promising fuels like this to take us away from oil dependency?
I'm a strong advocate. Thank you for that question. A strong advocate to have our country much less dependent on oil from the Middle East and other hostile parts of the world. We need to have more of our energy grown, produced, and explored here in America. Biodiesel is a great solution. The school buses in Gloucester County are running on biodiesel because it's right next to New Kent County. The problem with the biodiesel fuels or the renewables such as those is they can't be transported on pipelines, so they have to be trucked or use rail. What I'd like to see are more and more of such facilities, incentives, logically good, sound incentives for the creation of such facilities in Southside Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, Southwest Virginia, the Northern Neck, and the Eastern Shore. And you can also make these biofuels sometimes from cellulosic matter. But I think the biodiesel or soy diesel makes a great deal of sense. I ran into a farmer in Augusta County that's running on 99% soy diesel on his 3 combines. But we need to get more of it produced here in Virginia. It'll be good for jobs and investment in rural areas as well.
Mr. Webb, 30 seconds.
George Allen now has an energy plan. His energy plan for the last 15 years has been to take large contributions from oil, gas, and power production companies to the tune of $800,000, giving tax breaks to oil companies to the tune of $18 billion. We need to go to alternate sources. We need government incentives in order to do that. The Brazilian model is a great model to follow, and yes, there's no reason that we can't do solar, wind, nuclear, quite frankly, and ethanol.
Rick has the next question for Mr. Webb.
Mr. Webb, you once referred to affirmative action as state-sponsored racism. What did you mean by that at that time, and have you changed your position on that?
I have not changed my position. My belief is that affirmative action was designed as a 13th Amendment program, an amendment designed to repair the damages of slavery. If you go back to the Lyndon Johnson administration when it was first put into place, what happened after that is the program grew like Topsy, so that every ethnic minority was included in affirmative action to the point that the people who were excluded basically were the white males. And you can go to Southwest Virginia and see families down there, and some of them come from my father's own family who've had a very rough time for 200 years in getting educations and getting opportunities. So that's what I meant when I said state-sponsored racism. But my view on affirmative action is that it should go to its original intent, which is to assist African Americans. They're the only ethnic group in this country that suffered from generations of deliberate discrimination by our own government. And that is the distinction.
Mr. Allen.
I would add, in Virginia, American Indians, Virginia Indians, have been discriminated against as well. That was his answer, as convoluted as it was. Let me add on energy independence. We are the Saudi Arabia of the world in coal, and we ought to be using clean coal technology in our country. We also ought to be using advanced nuclear and exploring off our coasts. And if we do, 50% of the revenues of $3 billion could go for roads and transportation. A quarter of it could go to colleges and universities. And I believe we need to improve education at minority-serving institutions because of the separate but unequal laws of the past that our historically black colleges and universities need the assets, the faculty, to improve opportunities for young people. This is an important issue.
Let's move on. Let's move on. We want to thank Lulu, Rick, and May Lily for taking time out of their schedules and being with us tonight. Now we're going to move on to the next segment of our debate. We'll put everyone else aside and let the candidates ask the questions. Here's how it's going to work. For example, Mr. Webb has 30 seconds to ask Mr. Allen a question. Then Mr. Allen will have 2 minutes to respond. Then Mr. Webb will have a minute to follow up. Mr. Allen would then have 30 seconds to sum up his thoughts. We're going to repeat this a total of 4 times, so each candidate has the opportunity to ask 2 questions. Mr. Allen, you may ask the first question now, and again, you have 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Jim, John Warner and I have fought for tax relief for Virginia's families. We've passed tax relief in 2001, 2003, is producing record levels of employment and also government revenue. But earlier this year in the spring, you said, and I quote, "We can't spend $400 billion on a war and keep stimulating the economy with the tax cuts that are now in place." This summer, you stated again, and I quote, "I don't understand really how you can have a tax cut and be spending $500 billion on a war." Your campaign is being bankrolled by Senator Clinton and others. Let me, Mike. Okay, Mike.
Your time's up.
I've honored the bell. You need to honor the bell.
Your time's up, Mr. Webb.
To start off with, if you look at where this country has gone in the last 6 years, there's been a tremendous migration of wealth. In the 1980s, 8% of the income in this country went to the top 1%. Now, for a lot of reasons, 16% has gone to the top 1%. We have huge deficits. We kid ourselves if we don't say that we need more revenues. The question is, where do we get revenues? And one area that I want to focus on is where our corporate taxes are. We have a higher profit in terms of national wealth in corporations than at any time in our history, and yet you have 46 out of the top 500 corporations in America not even paying taxes at all. A big reason for that are the loopholes that have been built into corporate tax law, like the runaway factory loophole, which you voted twice to keep in place. So there are ways to get revenues, and you can't keep spending like this without increasing revenues.
Mr. Allen, you have 1 minute.
Sure. Now, my question is this to you. Do you know how many Virginians have benefited from the tax relief that you have criticized? What's that number?
Do you know that when you stopped things like the tuition tax credit for students, that more than 100,000 students and families lost that benefit to the tune of $4,000 a year?
My question is, do you know how many Virginians? What's the number of Virginians, rather than trying to divert?
I'm not diverting. I mean, you're asking me to answer a question about something which I do not agree in terms of how you're defining it.
It's a question. If you're going to make proposals, you ought to know how many Virginians are affected by the tax relief. What do you think
is the proposal that I made? It's not the one you put in your ad.
No,
I never said that I never said that I would agree with the tax increases that you've used in your ad.
Do you know how many people are benefiting from the tax cuts that you have criticized?
Did you know that you put 100,000 more people on the street? Did you know that?
I have voted for tuition assistance for families. In fact, we voted,
allowed
the
tuition
Democrats
tax credit to die last year.
Gentlemen, let's move on. Let's move on.
Well, the answer is 3 million Virginians. 3 million Virginians
the way that you
benefit from
define
this
the
tax
question,
relief.
George, it's
Thank
3
you very
million
much.
Virginians.
Well,
Gentlemen,
facts.
let's move on.
No, that's not the facts any more than your ad was.
Here
a
we
fact.
go again. Mr. Webb, your turn now. You have 30 seconds to pose a question to Mr. Allen.
All right, I'll ask you the same question that I asked you in the first debate. So you probably had some time to think about this. How can you vote to raise your own pay 4 times to the tune of more than $30,000 and vote 4 times not to raise the minimum wage?
I have voted 3 times to raise the minimum wage, and we voted, in fact, just this 2 months ago, to increase the minimum wage as well as provide tax relief, death tax relief for family farmers and small business owners. We voted for the tuition assistance or tuition deduction for college tuition. I have a daughter in college, and there are many college students. One of the things I'm most proud of as governor was making sure the tuition was affordable for in-state tuition for Virginians. The raises, you get raises that everyone else gets, but I voted against that in 2005. And the fact of the matter is I have voted for increasing the minimum wage, but I also want to provide relief to small businesses so jobs are still there and those small businesses are not damaged by raising the minimum wage. That is the appropriate approach that we took. In fact, it was a measure that took the best from all what the Democrats wanted and all the Republicans wanted. But unfortunately, your friends, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Ted Kennedy, and others obstructed that measure, although we had 57 votes to increase the minimum wage by $2.10 an hour, as well as provide tuition assistance, extend the research and development tax credit, provide a $10 million unified deduction or exemption from the death tax, because I think death should not be a taxable event, and there are so many family farms and small businesses that go under because they have to pay a 55-60% tax on death. And if you had your way, death taxes would come back. And in fact, there are 3 million people, again, Jim, in Virginia who have benefited from this tax relief. And it's a shame that you criticize the tax relief that we've passed, because it really does help millions and millions of Virginians, rather than listening to class warfare and criticism from you and your partisans, Democrats in Washington, that are bankrolling your campaign.
Mr. Webb, you have 1 minute to rebut this.
To start off with, you've never voted straight up to raise the minimum wage. The bill that you're talking about was an aggregate bill, and in fact, quite frankly, the part of that on the estate tax I thought was quite reasonable. And what you're doing, you're misrepresenting to the people of Virginia how I would vote on a large series of taxes because I question certain parts of it. And the numbers that you're using are aggregate numbers rather than specific numbers, George. And you know it. Just like your ad knows. The stuff in your ad is not even stuff I've taken a position on.
Mr. Allen, 30 seconds to rebut.
Jim, it is your own words. You are the one who said that you criticize all the tax cuts that are now in place. This is your words. And we should not have had a tax cut at all.
Tax cuts now in place.
You said the tax cuts that are now in place, and you shouldn't have a tax cut in a time of war. These are your own words from this fall, from this summer, and from this spring.
We will get the data, and we'll let the people of Virginia decide on that.
Fine. We'll show it to you as well.
Mr. Allen, it's your turn to ask a question. You have 30 seconds.
Okay. Jim, since we were attacked on 9/11, one of the main ways that we've prevented more attacks is through information gathering, gathering of intelligence on our enemies. In the recent session of Congress, there were two key issues related to this, and I'd like to ask your position on them. First, do you support the President's terrorist surveillance program by which the NSA monitors calls by terrorists and terrorist suspects? And second, do you agree with Senator Specter's position in favor of habeas corpus rights for detainees, or do you agree with President Bush, who opposes those rights?
Mr. Webb, 2 minutes.
Sounds to me like that's two questions rather than one question.
Well, it deals with
You have
one
2 minutes.
subject.
Well, here's the difficulty, and it's something that I and a lot of Americans have a great deal of concern over. When you look at the NSA wiretapping situation, we all want to be able to intercept information that can damage our national security. There's no question about that. But what you have in a situation where only the administration can decide and that there is no congressional oversight is we don't know who they're listening to. And when there have been proposals for people outside of the administration or outside of this small group of people to be able to examine who they're listening to, they've all been knocked down by this administration, including people from the judiciary branch. I happen to believe, having been a committee counsel in the Congress for 4 years, that there are plenty of people who work in the United States Congress who can get the appropriate security clearances to make sure that we have a government of checks and balances. And if there is some reason that the administration believes that other Americans shouldn't be looking at to make sure that we're not listening to, or you're not listening, or they're not listening to Colin Powell or George Allen while they're listening to other people, you know, what is the problem with administrative oversight?
1 minute for rebuttal, Mr. Allen.
Well, you didn't answer the question on the detainees' right to file these lawsuits. And probably the reason you didn't want to is because every Democrat, including Hillary Clinton, Ted Kennedy, John Kerry, except for one, Senator Nelson, voted contrary to it to have these lawsuits clogging up our courts. And I don't think we need detainees filing lawsuits, worrying about their conditions and high-speed internet access and wanting better dictionaries and DVDs. And I just think that's inappropriate. And insofar as that issue, you still have 30 seconds, and maybe you can give us an answer on whether or not you agree with President Bush or whether you agree with Senator Specter on these habeas rights for detainees.
I think what we have to do, and it is something that people who have broad military experience, people like John McCain, John Warner, and others sought to do, is to make sure that whatever we are doing with people under our jurisdiction is in accordance with the Geneva Accords and will not blow back on our own people who happen to be in harm's way. And that's the bottom line. You know, I know what it's like to be out there worrying about if I was going to be taken prisoner. And you know, you have to be able to have a moral high ground when you're dealing with the rest of the world on these kinds of issues.
Mr. Webb, your turn.
We have a situation in the Shinkaku Islands which could blow up into an international incident, and I'm wondering what you think about that, George.
I'd have to study the issue more fully to give you a complete answer.
Okay, this is not Craney Island. This is Shinkaku Island. Okay?
Well, Craney Island is important because that ultimately,
yes,
I'm sure you've studied it.
We did discuss that before.
And
this is important too. This is important to our national security. The Shinkaku Islands are east of Taiwan and west of the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa. They are claimed by China. They are administered by Japan. They have had 2 incidents in the Shikoku Islands over the past 2 years. If anything were to happen to the security of Taiwan, it would affect the Shikoku Islands and potentially blow over into Japan. And there is considerable oil in the Shikoku Islands.
Well, it is an important area to be worried about. As we said earlier, China is a concern. Some of the decisions we make, whether in Iraq or elsewhere, can have China miscalculating. As far as I'm concerned in Taiwan, is that we need to uphold the Taiwan Relations Act and defend Taiwan's ability to secure their own destiny, and they should not be forced to reunify. And China, if they did something like that, it would be a provocative act.
Mr. Webb, you have 30 seconds if you'd like to take it.
I'll pass.
We do have a few minutes here, so let me just throw a question out to you. I'll begin with you, Mr. Allen. Well, the same rules as before. A minute for your answer, 45 seconds for rebuttal. Back in July, over the summer, even late summer, I know you don't like to look at polls, you had a 16-point lead in this race. Now suddenly it's a statistical tie. What do you think happened?
Oh, the campaign got off on other things that were not issues, that were not ideas, not proven solutions, and a record of performance. Some of it I brought on myself. Some of it was just smears in the campaign. What I want to do is make sure this campaign is focused on issues, ideas, solutions that have a real impact on people's life and my proven record of performance. And if the campaign is focused on those things that really matter to people and their families and their small business owners, we'll win this campaign. And so a lot of things happened, but we're focused in this last 4 weeks of this campaign on issues, whether it's taxation, energy independence, whether it's better education, particularly in higher education, for minority-serving institutions. In fact, getting more Latinos, African Americans, and women interested in innovation, because we need to be the world capital of innovation, and we are in competition with countries 5 and 6 times our size, and we need more Americans interested and incented, even with scholarships, for these fields. And so those are the ideas I'm going to be advocating throughout Virginia the next four weeks.
Mr. Webb, 45 seconds.
Well, first of all, let me say that George Allen said on Monday in a 2-minute commercial that he was going to focus on issues, and then on Friday he ran another negative hit on me about an article that I wrote 27 years ago. And ironically, that woman claimed that she misquoted me. She wasn't even in my article. That's the kind of responsibility that I hope you can put into your campaign. But with respect to what's happened, I think people started focusing on this race. And they started looking at what we're trying to do and what we're trying to say. And that's how it tightened up.
Mr. Webb, there are reports that the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, knew that Congressman Mark Foley was sending inappropriate emails to House pages. Should Speaker Hastert resign? You have a minute.
My feeling on issues like this, and I saw them 25 years ago when I was a committee counsel in the Congress emanating toward the other party, is that there are leadership questions. Inevitably issues arise. There are leadership questions, and how the leadership handles those questions should define some accountability. I'm not going to be one to say that Speaker Hastert should resign. I haven't really followed this in intimate detail, but if the Republican leadership did not live up to the standards of the Congress, then there should be some sort of some sort of accountability for it.
Mr. Allen, you have 45 seconds. Should Speaker Hastert resign?
Let me first answer this question as a father. I find this behavior deplorable and despicable. These young people who work as interns and pages come there to Washington in idealism, and they should not be subjected to this sort of predatory behavior. In fact, as a senator, I've led the way in trying to crack down on internet predators, worked with Sheriff Mike Brown of Bedford County on Blue Ridge Thunder to try to stop this sort of activity. I support a full investigation, the FBI and everyone else investigating, and let the chips fall where they may. And anybody who was guilty in this should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. If it comes out in the facts that anybody put politics ahead of the protection of these children, then they should not be in a position of leadership. And moreover, no taxpayer should be paying for the pensions of anyone so dishonorably discharged from the Congress.
It is time now for our closing statements. Mr. Allen, you're first.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in this evening. Susan and I are deeply grateful for the opportunity we've had to serve you for more than a decade. We're thankful for your encouragement, your understanding, and most importantly, your prayers. Serving in public office is a great honor and a sacred trust. It's a chance to make a positive impact on people's lives. And if you allow me a second term to serve you in Washington, I'm going to make the best of it. While we've seen here tonight, issues really do matter. Knowledge, experience, and having a proven track record does matter. Understanding actually that Craney Island would be a fourth port and would create tens of thousands of jobs in Virginia does matter. Having a plan to make America energy independent matters a great deal. Making sure we have advanced education will make an impact and matters to young people and our future. Understanding the impact of your proposals on Virginia families before you propose them really matters. And the decision whether to impose a massive new tax increase on 3 million Virginians, as Mr. Webb and his friends propose, matters a great deal. It matters when your family is forced to pay an additional $2,000 a year in taxes. It matters whether our economy will stay strong or will it be dragged down by the weight of a massive tax increase. Elections matter for our safety and our security as well. The ability to get information and intelligence on our enemies and prevent the next 9/11 matters. Not letting enemies clog our courts with frivolous lawsuits matter. Not allowing Iraq to become a safe haven for terrorists and an oil-rich base for an even larger wave of attacks on our country matters. And my friends, having an independent United States Senator who will stand with John Warner and not Hillary Clinton matters a lot. Most of all, issues matter because it's your future that is on the line. Tonight, I respectfully ask you to allow me to continue working for you, our shared values, and our future together. Thank you so much.
Mr. Webb, your closing statement.
Parenthetically, I look forward to working with John Warner. I've worked with him when I was a young man as a Marine on his staff. He had some very kind things to say to me when I first began this campaign, and I think people have listened to me tonight and know that how absurd some of the things George Allen just said really are. In 4 weeks, the voters of Virginia are going to make a decision that will have far-reaching ramifications. On that, George Allen and I do not disagree. First, it will be a referendum on this administration. George Allen has been one of the administration's blinded supporters. He's voted with them 97% of the time and 100% of the time on foreign affairs. Second, it will mark a chance for many people to return to the Democratic Party. In the wake of 9/11 and in this era of globalization of our economy, the old labels of liberal and conservatives no longer fully apply. For those who previously identified with the Republican Party on issues of national security, but who never really felt comfortable on issues of social justice and economic fairness, just remember that the Republican Party has lost its way in the area of national security, and I would hope that many of you would decide to come home. Third, you're being offered a choice between two different visions of political America. I believe strongly that the power in our society should flow from the bottom up to the top. I believe that our representatives should be personally accountable to those who elect them, and that their principal duty should be to speak on behalf of those who have no voice in the corridors of power. There are more than 30,000 lobbyists circling around 535 elected representatives in Washington. The average American needs their senator to be their lobbyist, someone who cannot be bought and won't be bossed. I would like to be that senator, and I would be grateful for your support. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Election Day is just 29 days away, but tomorrow, October 10th, is the last day to register to vote in Virginia. It is also the last day to request an absentee ballot for anyone living or serving overseas. If you need to do either of these things, contact your city or county registrar of voters. They can be found at the Virginia State Board of Elections website. Do you want to know where to vote on November 7th? Go to the League of Women Voters website. It's vote411.org to locate your polling place before you go to vote. Again, that's vote411.org for election information you need. This program has been brought to you through the cooperation of CBS 6, WTVR, WCVE, and the League of Women Voters of Virginia Education Fund. To support the League's activities or join the League, just go to the League of Women Voters of Virginia's website. There you can find information on statewide and local election issues and candidates. We want to thank our candidates for joining us tonight and appearing on the same stage, but more importantly, we want to thank you, the voters of Virginia, for wanting to know more. If you heard something you like, or if you heard something you don't like, you can do something about it. Vote on November 7th. Thanks for watching, everyone. On behalf of everyone who brought this debate to you, I'm Russ Mitchell. Good night. Thank you.